How to get better grades in high school. Where there's a will, there's an A.
My first year in high school was so frustrating. I really wanted to get good grades, but no matter how long and how hard I studied, I just couldn't do it. I finished my last term with 3 B's, 3 C's, and an F. My dad read about Professor Olney's seminar, and he got me the tapes and the manual. It's only been 1 quarter since then, and I can't believe the difference. My grade point average has gone from a 2.1 to a 3.4. That's 4 A's, 3 B's, and a C.
Last year, my father bought me Dr. Olney's tapes. After listening to the tapes, not only did my grades improve, but getting good grades has become a lot easier. My average went from a 2.6 to a 3.4.
I learned about note-taking, essay writing, and many helpful skills that have just organized this whole year.
You've just listened to some students that have taken my seminar, listened to my tapes, and begun to excel in school. They're no different than you are. If you listen to these techniques and apply them, you'll do just as well, maybe better. I knew this was going to be a special day for me when I walked through the lobby and a young man by the name of Steve, he had his name tag on, works here, hollered to me and he said, "Hey, Professor Olney, what are you doing here today?" And I said, "I'm giving a seminar." He says, "You know, I took your seminar 2 years ago." And I asked him how he did, and he said, "You won't believe it. I went from a 2.1 or 2 to a 3.5. And I said, "Well, that's great." He says, "Well, you know what? My dad really liked it too, and he's now agreed to pay my college tuition." Well, you know, when you look around here today, you may think, gosh, all these bright people, what kind of a seminar is this? I thought that people that went to seminars, especially seminars to get better grades, would probably be below average students. And yet, when you look around, there's a lot of bright people here. I think maybe I ought to tell you what a bright person is. A bright person is nothing more than an average-looking person who seems to do the right things, seems to have the right study skills, seems to take tests right, seems to do problems maybe a little quicker, maybe a little easier. But you know what? We can all do that. We're probably using only 2 or 3 or 4% of our brain. Can you imagine if we leave here today with between 100 and 150 study techniques, and you only apply maybe 25 or 30 or 35 of them, can you imagine what you're going to do? Why is it going to be so much easier for you to leave here today and get better grades? Do you know what the answer is? Because there's so little competition. There are so few people using study techniques and skills. Look at this article that just appeared in our local paper. It says 17-year-olds are dismal in math. Only 6% of the 15,000 high school students that they checked could solve 2- and 3-step algebra and geometry problems. And 1/4 of them said that they didn't understand what was going on in their math classes. So getting better grades is going to be relatively easy if we start using the right tools. And that's the problem with a lot of students. They pick the wrong tool. What would you think of a person went into their toolbox, and instead of picking out a sharp axe, they pulled out a sledgehammer to take a tree down? Now, you know, that's an easy thing to figure out. A sharp axe will get the job done in a relatively short period of time with relatively little effort, at least compared to using a sledgehammer. And yet there's so many students today that use a sledgehammer approach to get good grades. But you know what? You do not get credit for time spent studying, and you do not get credit for hard work. Have any of you ever taken a test and gotten it back, and at the top of the test, you get a grade for correct answers, and then you get another grade for the amount of time you spent, and then you get a third grade for the amount of effort you put in? I venture to say that none of us, in my 20 years of teaching, I have never given a test like that. All I do is give credit to students for right answers. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to learn how to put the right answers down on tests. And I'm not going to tell you to study hard, because that is not the answer to getting better grades. A study at Penn State indicated that there are two things that are more important than hard work in getting better grades. One was simply attendance. And the other one, strange as it sounds, was simply sitting in the front row. People that attended every day and sat in the front row consistently got higher grades than people that missed class and that sat way in the back. I think the next logical question that any of us ought to ask me, in other words, a question that you ought to be asking me is, okay, why did this seminar work for those people? And why is it going to work for me? It's a good question. Well, it's because I had to make it work. Let me explain why this whole thing came about. I had been teaching out at ASU for about 14 years. My first son was going to high school here, and he did about what I did. He did enough just to get by. When I was in high school, I thought, hey, I guess that's what you do. You get enough to get by. And he did that. So we never really paid much attention to his grades. Well, when it came time for applying for college, it turned out he was just underneath the upper half of his high school graduating class, and he was turned down. I was devastated. I told my colleagues out at the university that my 3 children would be coming out here. What would you have done had you been in my place as a parent? Probably the same thing that I did. I rushed out. We got some letters from different people. He went to his high school counselor, got letters, filed a petition to get in, took him out to the admissions office, and lo and behold, he was accepted conditionally at ASU. Now the next step was, how do we keep him in there? You know, it'd be kind of embarrassing to be out there teaching and have your own son just kind of going along and not doing well. So I did what parents, I think, would do, and that is I rushed out and I bought every book I could find on how to study, how to take tests. I even went to some seminars like this. Were expensive ones, $300, $400, $500, but it was worth it to me. I went to a memory seminar. I can't remember what happened there. But you know what? I learned a little bit from each one. And I learned a little bit from each of the books that I read. Since then, I've gone through over 100 books. I'm not suggesting that you do it. It would cost you thousands of dollars. So what I've done was I've taken the nuggets out of each one of those books and those seminars. And I came up with a lot of little techniques on my own. And we experimented. My 3 children and I, we experimented for years on these different techniques to see which ones worked. And I asked hundreds of former students what worked for them. And that whole huge amount of work and effort and money spent, I've cut down to about 3.5 hours. And that's why we're here today. to find those special things that will change your life. You know what the book said so much, so often? You got to study hard. You can't watch all this television. School's going to be hard. It's not going to be easy. I couldn't tell my children that. I didn't want to tell them, hey, look, maybe you ought to give up. It's going to be kind of hard. Oh, what happened to my first son after we started using these techniques? Do you know he started out with 7 A's in college? He was on the dean's list every single year. He graduated cum laude. In fact, he ended up teaching in the physics department as a teaching assistant in his junior and senior year. Now he's enrolled in graduate school at ASU. This is someone that was told by the admissions office that he did not belong in college. The only thing that Robert told me was, I wish that we would have come up with these techniques when I was in high school. What a waste. I spent 4 years in high school struggling along, wasting a lot of time, nervous about tests, stress. I'm sure a lot of you go through some of these things. Mediocre grades, wondering if you're going to get in school. And that's why we're here today. We're going to give you a chance. You don't have to wait till you get to college to try out these unique methods of study. Now, number 1 in the manual, get creative. Get innovative. Start using a little bit more than 3% of your brain. We've got trillions of brain cells. If we give them a chance, they'll do wondrous things for us. And the first technique under getting creative, I want you to start studying less. I want you to start spending less time in the library. I want you to start spending less time in a room. Some parents back there are giving me kind of a quizzical look. And I notice there's a couple of teachers back there. They're wondering themselves. But that's what I want you to do, is start studying less and start getting better grades by studying smart. Put the sledgehammer away. Don't spend 4 hours cutting a tree down with the wrong tool. Funny thing is, it works. My 3 children have tried these along with hundreds of other students, thousands of other students across the country. Let's prove to you right now that studying less is going to work a lot better than spending a lot of time. I'm going to write down, 6 or 7 or 8 numbers. Don't write these down. I've just got them down on a piece of paper. And all I'm going to do is recite these numbers to you. And don't really give it a second thought. Here are the numbers. And I'll make sure, because I'll have them in my hand so I don't forget them myself. 3, 18, 27, 31, 42, 16, and 7. How many can tell me what the middle number is? No one? Take a guess.
27.
27, she says. That's close. 16. That's not quite as close. 42. 42. That's close. You're on the other side. 31, he said. Someone said, no, it's 21. You're right, it is 31. Glad you came today. Now, what is the first number? Anyone know that one?
3.
What's the last number?
7.
How in the world do we all remember the first and last number, but only 1 or 2 of us can remember the middle number? Isn't that strange? Well, actually, it isn't strange at all. Because the first and the last things that we study, make a mental note of this, because the first and last things that we study are the easiest to recall. In our manual, we have, some of you people will be listening to these on cassette tapes around the country. So there is a diagram in the manual. For us here today, and for people that watch this on video, let me just draw this on the easel. Here's our concentration level. When we start studying, it's at a nice high level. And then gradually, as we go into our study session, it bottoms out. And then right at the end, it goes back up to a fairly high peak. And what we've just done here today is we've noted that the first is the easy one to remember because that's the peak. And then we start dropping. Let's say that this is a total of 1 hour. And how many first and last situations do we have? We've got two easy ones that we can easily recall. What if we did this? What if we cut that hour into maybe 6 sessions of 20 minutes or 10 minutes each? Do you know how many first and last situations we'd have? We'd have 12. If we only cut it into 3 sessions, we'd have what? A first, a last, another one, another, a 5th, and a 6th. Can you see what would happen if you're studying math problems or vocabulary, foreign language? Instead of, and notice what happens to the concentration level. These shorter sessions, our concentration level is not going to drop off the way it does in a long session. And so can you see, we're actually deceiving ourselves when we sit in a library for 2 or 3 hours. We honestly believe that somehow knowledge will come through the chair, even though we kind of doze off and our concentration level drops even further. That's what a lot of students do. They come to me out at ASU. Do you know that I sat up last night for 5 hours straight studying for your exam and I only got a 75? Can you explain that to me? Sure. You studied about 3-4 hours too long. What? You studied too long. Why didn't you try studying in short bursts? Study vocabulary for 5 or 10 minutes. Carry an index card around with you with a half a dozen vocabulary words. Keep them in your shirt pocket or in your purse. This is going to save you a lot of time, and you're going to learn more. We'll talk more about this when we get into number 7, where I talk about memory. Another technique, turn in picture-perfect exams. Now, how do you turn in a picture-perfect exam? Do you have an erasable pen? You got a pencil. Let's change that. Here's an erasable pen. Do you have one? No? Do you? Do you have one? Okay, here's a couple more. Maybe you can just pass these back. Now, what do you think you could do with this erasable pen and an essay exam? Pardon? You can rewrite your mistakes, he said. Here are 2 blue books. Remember these? One's got a C, one's got an A. The A blue book is very neatly written with comments. This is very nicely done. The C blue book has all kinds of errors. There are things that are crossed out. There are arrows to other pages. There are sloppy erasures. There are words that are written up and down the margins. Well, a friend of mine who attended Northwestern back in Evanston, Illinois years ago had an instructor with a class about this large. There must be, what, we've got 150 people here today? And he tried an experiment. What he did was he took home his stack of essay exams in these blue books, and he asked his wife, who had beautiful penmanship, would you please rewrite about a half a dozen of the sloppy blue books, and I'd like to try a little experiment to see if it made any difference if blue book was neat or sloppy. And she consented and did it. Then he put fictitious names on it, and he stuck those blue books back into this stack of 150, and he gave them to his teaching assistants with instructions on grading the papers. And one of them did 1 through 3, and next one had question 4 through 6, and so on. He was amazed when he got the blue books back. The rewritten blue books with beautiful hand penmanship received on average an A grade. The sloppy blue books with identical content on average got a C. Now you say, well, that's not fair, is it? That appearance should make so much difference? Hey, I didn't write the rules. That's how life is. You know, you buy a nice car, why? It looks great. You buy a nice designer dress, you pay $50 or $100 for it, when you probably get by with one for $12.95. It looks great. It doesn't keep you any warmer. That's how life is. We might as well take advantage of that. Another technique. Here we sit with these TV cameras and these lights. I asked a few people here, would you be a little nervous? Do you think your knees would knock a little bit? Do you think your tummy would get a little tight if you came up here and tried to give a speech up here with all this stuff going on and we got a false start and we had to start over? Would be a little tough to do. Hey, don't be afraid to admit it. In survey after survey, it was discovered that giving a speech in public in front of a large group and then add all these cameras and lights is one of the scariest things that you could do. People rated skydiving and auto racing and everything else as easier than giving a speech in public. Now, why is it so difficult to do something that you can already do? We can all talk, right? We can all walk. That's about it. All you do is you get up, you walk up here, you start talking, and that's it. That isn't it. Psychologically, it's devastating to most people to get up. Their mouth gets dry, they get sweaty palms. Well, you know how it is. Wouldn't it be nice to leave here today and be able to go back to your classrooms and give a beautiful presentation and get an A in it and feel good about it? How do you do it? I'm going to tell you right now. It's relatively easy. First of all, let's just have, can you give me your name? Randy. How about you? Barbara. Barbara what?
Vivian.
All right. Another one. Do you want to say something other than your name? No, she said. We've had 3 public speeches already. And you see how easy it was? It just came out like, why, it's nothing to it. Well, what is it then about speech? Is it that you have to speak more than 2 words? Is it a 5-word speech that scares us to death? Is it 10? Is it a number? No, you know what it is? It's having to look out at all these faces watching me. That's what's so scary about giving a speech. And then you wonder, you're going to forget what you got up to say. All right, I'm going to give you a real quick little speech. Maybe you want to do this in a science class or maybe any place where you have to give a speech. The way to give a speech easily is to use props so that you don't have to look out here. You can look at a prop. This prop happens to be a little night light What could you do with a nightlight other than simply use it to light up a room at night? We're going to talk about right and left brain after a while. The left brain is the logical brain. The left side of the brain is the logical side. The right side is the creative side, the inventive side. We all have two sides. We may not use them as well as we should. The left brain would tell me something. About 10 years ago, I thought to myself, you know, I wish we would have installed a turn-down thermostat in our house so that when we go to bed at night, the living room would turn down and we'd save electricity or gas with heat. And then in the morning, it would turn on again with a little clock. So I finally, about 6 months ago, called a furnace company and I said, how much is one of those little turn-down thermostats, those little timers? They said, about $200 for a good one installed. $200, that's a lot of dough. Then my right brain went into action. And I took this little $3.50 nightlight, which turns on and off automatically. You know, there's a little eye in there, so when it gets dark, then this light goes on, and then in the morning, when it gets light, then this light goes off. And I hooked this thing up just underneath our thermostat. Now, you don't have to be too versed in science to know what's going to happen next. Just think about it for a moment. What happens if this thing lights up and gets warm, and the warm air rises into the thermostat? It's going to cause it's going to trick the thermostat into thinking that it's a little warm, and it's going to turn the furnace off at night. And in the morning, when this little thing goes off, when it gets light out, the furnace will go on just before I get up, and I'll walk into a nice warm living room. Isn't that a cute little speech? I mean, wouldn't you be kind of interested in listening to speeches like this all day instead of some guy getting up, hello, I'm a freshman, and last summer I went on a vacation to northern Wisconsin. You know, that's going to kill you. Oh, now how do I remember? Because that's our other problem. See, I've eliminated having to look at you because now I can look at this thing and keep talking about it and show how it plugs in, you see? And I can forget that you're here. But how can I remember what I'm supposed to say? Oh, this is great. I've got that little speech outlined on my prop. Isn't that neat? You've eliminated the two problems. The problem of having everyone looking at you and you looking back, and the second problem of worrying whether you will forget what you're going to talk about. You can do this with anything. My son was in a presidential history class. He got up and talked for a full period on presidential assassinations. Do you know how he did it? He brought in all kinds of props. The teacher said that was a fascinating class. The students liked it too. He brought in weapons broken down so that they didn't scare people, pieces of glass, pieces of metal to show how bullets go through cars and how bulletproof glass works. Makes for a fascinating speech. So what have we learned so far? The big difference in getting good grades is not IQ. It's not anything mysterious. It's just using the right skills and the right techniques. And you know what? We can psych ourselves into using the right techniques. We can psych ourselves into getting better grades. Let's look at our pen again. What if we did this? Little psychological trick that you play on your own brain. You take this pen home with you and you write your notes from your book into your notebook. Now those notes, of course, are going to be accurate, aren't they? Because you're copying right out of the book. Now you take that same pen and you go to your class and you take down notes that the teacher gives. And those are the correct notes. So far, the only thing that this particular pen has done is write correct answers. It doesn't know how to write wrong answers. Now you go into an exam and you take that pen in with you, and just before you start, you look at it, you look at this friend of yours and say, you're going to write the right answers in here. And you know what? It'll work. It works in all areas of life. Bowlers wouldn't dream of using someone else's bowling ball in a tournament. Golfers wouldn't dream of using a different putter. Baseball players get a little strange about it. I had one in my class a couple of semesters ago. When I told about that in the class, he says, "Oh, you can't imagine what we go through the dressing room. People dress, they put their left sock on always first because that's the time. When they did it one time, they hit a home run." He says, "I've got a t-shirt that's tattered, practically all worn out, but I still wear it because I pitched almost a perfect game with it one time." Psychologically, it's the same as getting up here and giving the speech, you see. The only thing that's stopping us is this psychological barrier. We can talk, we can walk, we can get up here. So remember that. Get yourself a pen that writes the right answers. Have you ever seen that little clip on television where the little baby elephant is tied to a stake by a clothesline that's not more than any thicker than this pen? And it's pulling at it, and it's pulling at it, and it's pulling at it. It can't get away from it, of course. After about a week of tugging, do you know what it does? It gives up. It finally realizes that it just can't break this string. Then that elephant, as it grows larger and larger and larger, and you see these elephants in India, and they've got this stake in the ground, they've got this little rope. Why doesn't that huge elephant snap that rope and walk off? Because it tried it when it was little, and it didn't work, so it's never tried again. That's how psychology works. And a lot of us are maybe studying that way. And now's the day to change it. Have you ever seen a dog in a room scratching away at the door to get out? Why do you think it keeps scratching? For fun? Or do you think that it thinks that it can get out eventually? Obviously, it thinks that it'll eventually get out, otherwise it would quit scratching. What would you think if you came over to our house? We've got 2 dogs, we have a little door, trained our dogs to go in and out of the door. You could even train a dog to turn the knob with its teeth and go out. Oh, I think that if you came to someone's house and you saw that, you'd say, "Hey, bright dog." It's the same dog. All it's done is been given one technique that saves a lot of time and a lot of effort and gets results. So don't be fooled into thinking that you've got to work hard, sit in your room for hour on end, studying. You're fooling yourself, just like the dog's fooling himself, scratching at the door. If you added all the hours that you spend in high school, what is it, about 25 or 30 hours in the classroom every week? If you put those things end to end, how many hours do you think that you'd spend? You know what? It's only about 4 months in hours. That's all the time that just average person spends in high school, if you take all the hours and add them end to end. That's a relatively short period of time. Look at this article that I pulled out of the paper just this month. It says, "That's life. We spend 6 years. If you took all the hours and stacked them up, we spend 6 years of our life sitting eating." Now that isn't too startling, but this is what's startling. It says, the average person waits in line for 5 years of his or her lifetime, just waiting in line. If you lived in Russia, it'd probably be 15 years. So maybe we should consider ourselves a little lucky. It said, we spend 6 months doing nothing more than sitting, waiting at red lights. That's 2 months more than we spent in high school. Well, if that's the case, maybe we ought to use up some of that time. And the article went on further to say that most people don't realize how much time they spend and how much time they waste just waiting. a student of mine by the name of John Coates over at ASU. He had a roofing business with a half a dozen employees. And he told me that one of the best points that he got from this seminar a couple of years ago was using waiting time. And he said, you know, I don't have a lot of time. I'm running around all day in my car. I'm bidding on jobs. I'm waiting in the bank. I'm waiting here, waiting there, waiting for people, waiting for employees, waiting for materials. And he said, I started using your system. I got the 3x5 index cards, put in my shirt pocket. Every time I had to stop someplace, I'd pull them out. Do you know what I found out? I didn't have to study at all at home anymore at night. I could relax and watch TV and take it easy. And he said, and my grades went up. Now there's something else that I've got to tell you about this particular use of short bursts. Tony Bassan, in a book, Make the Most of Your Mind, he came up with these short bursts, just as my student did. And what he also said was this: the mind needs intervals between absorbing materials. If you go to a party and are introduced to somebody, chances are you're going to forget that name after a while. But on the other hand, if at that same party that person's name comes up a half a dozen times on different occasions throughout the evening, it's now going to begin to go from your short-term memory into your long-term memory. You see, when we initially get introduced to someone and we hear the name once, it's kind of short-term. It's kind of like when you look into a phone book and get a number and dial it, and just a few moments later you can't remember it. You get a busy signal, you've closed the book, you know, now you want, oh, I can't remember that, and then you got to look it up again. Long-term memory takes place by running through intervals, and they can be very short. You could study vocabulary, for instance, for 5 or 10 minutes, and then do something else, move on to something else, then come back to those words, then move to something else, come back, maybe at night, go over it again. First thing in the morning, go over it again. While you're getting ready, just have these cards up. My kids had little labels around for vocabulary because each one of them took a foreign language in high school and college. I had another friend by the name of Austin who used another technique. He got himself a tape recorder. He read his lessons into the tape recorder. On the way to school in the evening, going to night school, he'd plug it in the cassette player in his car and listen again. Then he would tape the lecture and listen to that on the way home. He said, you know what, that's all I needed. That's a great method to consider. You're beginning to use more and more of your senses. You're looking, you're having to talk, then you're listening back. You see what happens? You're tripling what you can do instead of just simply quietly reading. My son came up with an innovative technique, and right now I'm going to ask him, I'm going to surprise him and ask him to come down here and tell you what he did in a class that he was in. He thought he had bitten off more than he could chew because he got into an art class, and the first exam they flashed all kinds of paintings on the wall. This is Robert, and he is the one that is responsible for all of us being here today. He applied, and he's on the honor roll every year, but he did have a close call, and I'm wondering right now, could you just explain what happened in that class?
Well, I was taking a Mexican art class, and the teacher had all kinds of slides in there which he had taken down in Mexico. And he would shine these slides on the wall in the class. And then what we had to do as students was to look at the slides and figure out who the artist was, where the painting was, when it was done. And after about the first few days of class, all these paintings, he'd show about 30 of them in the class, they all started to look alike. So after the first test, I'm just sitting there watching, and I said, well, this one looks just like the one that I just saw before that. So the first test, I didn't really do so hot on it. After that, the next day of class, he kind of apologized for one of the pictures that he had taken. He said, well, I'm sorry, I left the filter on this one because it turned out a little bit yellow. So I thought, well, I'll just kind of write that down. So that was how I started taking notes in there. And I noticed other things like this. He had pictures where the same artist had everything in the same museum, and they had these little ropes in front of the pictures. So I'd mark that down. And other pictures, he'd have of buildings where he'd leave his car parked out in front. So I'd note that, okay, the one where his car is, that's by another artist. So when I went into the next test, I went in there and the stress was completely gone, and I was able to go in, take the test, and get an A on it. Now, you're probably all wondering, well, do you really learn the stuff by doing that? And the answer to that is that you do. Because after a while, it got to the point where the stress was gone, and I could just go in there, sit in there, and watch the teacher and watch what all the slides were. And I'd be able to take down the notes in the way that he wanted us to learn these things.
Okay, thanks, Robert. Let me give you another reason why you actually do learn by using techniques. Because some people think, well, isn't this a little bit bizarre to use this pen and these things? And it doesn't really make much difference how you learn things. If you can use techniques to learn things, and you've got them locked in your brain. Let me give you a second example of why I know that it works. I've got two more children. James came a year after Robert. And then I had a daughter in junior high school at the same time, Susan. In fact, they're sitting out in the audience right here. I wonder if you could just, there's Susan and there's James right there. Susan's in that gray third row in the gray, and James is in the white shirt. Okay, let me tell you about James. James is your typical high school athlete. What do we think about the typical high school athlete as far as brains are concerned? Oh, everyone says. And you know what? Psychologically, you can begin to believe that you're not supposed to get good grades, and so James slid by. But then he tried these techniques. He had an 11 on his ACT score. You need a 21 to get into ASU, so we had to file a petition again, but I was getting good at it by this time. And he was admitted. He started out with 9 A's and made the dean's list. Graduated. His last semester at ASU, he had straight A's his last semester. Well, did he learn the material? I've got some of his, if he weren't here today, I'd show you his high school report cards with his grades in Spanish, but I'm not going to do that. But they weren't real high. But he took Russian at ASU. Can you imagine that? Taking Russian after not being able to go through Spanish real good with an A, takes Russian. What does he get from Russian? Got 2 A's. One day, a lady that restored paintings came over to our house, and she had a thick accent, and I asked her where she was from, and she said she's formerly from Russia. Spoke Russian. I said, oh, can I have my son? He's never spoken to someone from Russia. He's taking Russian. Would you mind talking to him? She said, sure. So I called James, and he came downstairs, and I said, James, this is Mrs. So-and-so, and she speaks Russian, and they started chattering in Russian. And they were talking back and forth, and this lady's face lit up. I finally interrupted, and I said, why are you looking at her like that? And she said, I can't believe how beautifully your son speaks. How in the world did he ever learn to speak Russian that fluently? That was my proof that these techniques do work. So don't worry. You don't have to tell everyone about your lucky pen, but they do work. All right, number 2 is goals. Of course, when I started out 7 years ago, my goal was to get my 3 children right up there, the B range. Well, as it turns out, they got up into the A range. In a study from Yale that I have here, let me just refer to it, because they've got about 7 points that they discuss. The top 3% in this study were students who wrote down their goals. Daily goals, weekly goals, monthly. And 30 years later, they tracked those same students to see how they were doing in life, and they were the 3% at the top in success, and they were still writing down their goals. So I suggest to you, start writing goals. Don't have them in your head. An architect would get pretty confused if he just had your house plan in his head, and I don't think you'd like that either. Number 2, they said, be specific. Don't say on your goal list that you're going to get good grades. Say something more specific. I'm going to get an A in history by making up questions that might be on the next test. The third one, be positive. Jack Nicklaus, for instance, mentally plays every single shot before he swings a club. He visualizes where the ball is going to go. There was a war veteran article in the paper. He was in Vietnam for 5 or 6 years, lost all kinds of weight, got down to about 100 pounds. But he played golf mentally in his mind for all those years. And he stunned people when he came back, when he went out on the golf course, before he had recovered, and he was able to play as well as he had before he left. All areas of our life ought to cover our goals. Our social goals, our physical goals, spiritual, mental, emotional, even our diet. Have a goal for diet. And put them in time frames. Tomorrow, next week, next month. Another thing that's suggested is keeping score. Maybe you sleep on the floor if you don't meet your goal today. Get a little hard on yourself. And finally, tailor your own goals. If a B is your very best and you get a B, that is very good. But if you are capable of an A and you only try for and get a C, that ought to be unacceptable, at least to ourselves. And maybe we should sleep on the floor that day. Sometimes we do the best under pressure. I had a student in my class some years ago. I'll refer to him as Mr. Trumpet because he had a band. He sat in the front row. I happened to be chairman of the honors committee that year, and he was also in the honors program. So I got to know him a little bit better than I did other students. But I was surprised one day when he told me what he went through daily. He was carrying 3 or 4 additional hours. He was married and he had a child. He said he was working between 40 and 60 hours a week with his band, and they traveled around. They got very good and they became very popular. And I said, well, how in the world do you stay on the honors, the dean's list like this, and in this honors program? He said, well, I had to come up with certain techniques. And one of the techniques, and he showed me part of the book that we were using, a very small portion, maybe about 40 pages. And I said, well, what's that all about? He says, well, I'm on an airplane. You can't imagine the time that is wasted sitting in terminals and on planes and in hotel rooms. So what I do is, instead of taking this huge textbook along, I just tear the pages out. I said, that's kind of expensive. He says, yeah, but I make a lot of money. And he said, what I do is I take those pages and I put them in my trumpet case and carry it right on the plane with me, and I take it out and I go through my notes. And I noticed that his pages had strange marks on them. Instead of the typical yellow marker. Does anyone have a yellow marker? You mark everything in the book that's important? Why are we doing that? Again, we're deceiving ourselves, just like the dog scratching at the door, or the person sitting in the library for a couple of hours. What we're really doing when we mark everything in yellow is we're tricking our mind. We're telling our mind, I'll get back and we'll learn this later. We'll put off learning until later. That's really what we're doing. Instead of learning it now, we'll come back to it. And he said, I didn't have time to come back. And besides, nobody else seems to use yellow markers out in the world. And he asked me a question. He said, you have a car? I said, sure. He said, how about your car manual? Do you mark everything in yellow in there? And he says, well, no, of course not. He says, well, why should I mark everything that's important in my textbook? Everything in my textbook ought to be important. If it isn't, the editors ought to take it out. And I said, well, what are those little marks that on the page? He said, this is what I do. When I'm sitting on a plane reading the material, I go through it, and if I don't know something or I'm not sure of something, I put a little mark in the margin. And then I come back to it. And I keep coming back to it until I am absolutely positive that I know it, and then I check it off. That's a simple method of eliminating a lot of reviewing, because I asked him, well, what do you do before a test? He said, I take it easy. I spend time with my baby and my wife. There's no need to review these things that I know any more than there's a need for you to review how your car works before a trip. If you know how it turns on, why would you go back to your car manual? So you see, sometimes it's very profitable if you're pressed for time. Now, a good goal might be precision. That might be a great goal to have. A misspelled word in a paper, for instance, or on a test. It's like a spot on your clothes. It just glares out. We don't notice all the correct ones. We don't notice the rest of the shirt. We just notice that spot. A mispronounced word. Have you ever heard people say they are going to escape? There is no word like escape. It's escape. How about picture? That's a picture. These things on the wall, those are called pictures. Haven't you heard that? How about the state? Massachusetts. There is no such state. It's Massachusetts. We could go on and on. Some people like to pronounce the T in often. But there is no T that's pronounced in often. You've heard it, often. Look at this. I saw this little item just recently in the paper. Here's what it said. 40 years ago, a young Navy veteran who hoped to be congressman went to a Polish-American war memorial service. The speakers before him stumbled over famous Polish heroes. And the audience was getting a little uneasy about it because they were Polish Americans in the audience. And then this young man got up, and in his brief talk, he pronounced each of the Polish names flawlessly. Paderewski, Pulaski, Kosciuszko. Of course, I can pronounce these because I came from Milwaukee, and we've got Pulaski High School, we've got Kosciuszko Park, so it's easy for me. But he pronounced those and others flawlessly. The people were so impressed that in the election, 95% of the votes went to this young congressman. It later helped him in winning the presidency. His name was John Kennedy. I suggest earlier to make your goals realistic. Don't be afraid to aim a little high because you might hit your target. Now, number 3, exercise your brain. I'm going to put 9 dots on the board. Are you left-brained or right-brained? Before we look at these dots. And if you're listening on cassettes, these are in the manual. The left-brained person is the verbal person. It's the person who has, or who likes math, science, law, medicine, accounting. They're the kind that their checkbook's got to balance just right. Logical, analytical thinkers. The right-brained person is the visual person. They'll remember a face a lot easier than they'll remember a name. I'm a right-brained person. I remember faces, I can't remember names. Or I shouldn't say that. I remember names, I just have difficulty recalling them, because we're going to remember everything that passes through our lives. It's just a matter of how can you recall some of these things. Art, music, drama, business, writing, these are all right brain traits. Oh, let's try a little experiment here. just take your hands and clasp your fingers together on the desk. Have your thumbs crossed. All right? Now look down. Which thumb is on top? Psychologists say that if your right thumb is on top, you have a tendency of being more right-brained. If your left thumb is on top, you have a tendency of being left-brained. A lot of people, of course, are right in between someplace. Well, I like the idea that we're either logical, analytical, into math and science, and that'll make for a left-brained person. We can balance our brain, because this is the way to study, if we use both sides. Can you imagine only using half an engine? If you could put in 4 more spark plugs on the other side and have 8 cylinders going instead of 4, we can do the same thing with our brain. What if we are right-brained? What if we are kind of the daydreamer type, the innovative type, the inventive type, the artist? How can we adapt our brain to doing a better job on the left side with our science and our math courses? One of the easiest ways to do it is to simply start doing left brain things. And the easy way of doing that is to simply watch television. Start watching left brain programs. Start tuning into Nova. Because it's difficult for a right brain person to sit down with a science book. It's tough. You sit there and daydream and your mind wanders all over the place. So watch those programs. Watch Smithsonian World. Watch The Living Planet. Watch National Geographic. Watch Nature. It's like being in a classroom. Mr. Wizard is even back. I remember from years ago, Mr. Wizard. Remember him? He's back on television. What an easy way to learn science. We can program our brains for success. We can go a step further. We could even program other people's brains for success. When I first came out to Arizona, when we were first married, my wife taught at a little school in Scottsdale. Taught 2nd and 3rd grade. She came in at the middle of the semester because the 2nd or 3rd grade teacher had a heart attack. What's she getting into? You get a heart attack teaching 2nd grade? Well, anyway, she went into this room and she found out that the teacher had classified the students in the room into 3 reading groups. The bluebirds, the redbirds, and the whitebirds. These are little birds with a little color. The bluebirds were the good readers. The whitebirds were the average readers, and the poor little redbirds were the poor readers. My wife thought, that is terrible. These poor little kids are going to have such low self-esteem. I think I'm going to mix them up. And so she started mixing them around. And she discovered something very strange. Whenever she put one of the lower readers into a higher group, that reader seemed to come up to the standard of the group. And after a while, she started getting rid of the red group altogether and stuck them up into the white group. And the white group went into the blue group. And at the end of the semester, everyone was in the blue group with their little blue bird. And they were all reading at a high level. She had psyched them in to success. Now, let me let you in on something. You can psych your teachers into success. I'll give you 2 quick examples. Let's assume that you can figure out if your teachers are right or left-brained. Well, a lot of courses it's easy. The art teacher is going to be right-brained and the math teacher is going to be left-brained. It's real simple. The other teachers, you may want to have them fold their hands for you. Just ask them, hey, would you fold your hands a minute before I take this class? I want to see where your thumbs are. I had a student in my class who, out at ASU, he had 39 A's and 1 B, graduating with a 3.99 average. I asked him, he was a lifeguard during the summer, athletic-looking young man, and I asked him, why don't you go and talk to that teacher? He says, oh, I don't want to go and plead for a grade, the heck with it. I said, you know what, 20, 30 years from now, you'll be sorry if you don't just at least give it a try. I'll think about it. About 3 months later, I saw him on the stairway, and he was smiling. I knew what had happened. I said, you saw your teacher, didn't you? And he says, yep. I says, what'd you do? He said, I took my transcript in, and I put it on his desk, and I said, what would you do if you had this transcript? And this swimming instructor, he got 1B in a 1-credit swimming class. And the instructor looked at these grades and he said, boy, did I give you that B in swimming? He said, yes. That was all the student said, yes. And the teacher said, let me look at your grades again. Looked at his grades, he says, you know, you got the highest grade in the class, you got a B+, but you know, I never really thought that anyone should get an A in something like swimming. I thought it was maybe reserved for math or science, but in this case, I think I'll make an exception. And he changed the grade. A right-brained swimming instructor will be flexible. A left-brained instructor is going to be very rigid. You're going to have to approach the left-brained person with logic, with rational arguments. You're going to have to be very analytical. I read in the paper that a law student who had taken a bar exam found out that one of the cases on the exam that he had answered apparently incorrectly, a case similar to it appeared in the United States Supreme Court where it went his direction. So he went in and he presented his case and he said, look, we've got a recent case here. The decision was the same as the answer I gave in the test. I believe that I'm entitled to have that grade changed. And they changed it. They were willing to listen to logic. There are only 2 parts of our body that we can develop on our own. Did you know that? Our muscles. You can do something with your muscles. You can do something with your brain. You can't do much about making your hair turn. You can't do much about changing the fingernails. But you can do something with those 2 things. And here's what I suggest. Before taking a test or before going into a study session, try this simple 4-step method of preparation to reduce the tension. These were talked about in a book called Super Learning. I'm going to quote from it. First of all, try scrunching up. Just take your hands and just squeeze them as hard as you can for about 4 seconds. Do the same thing with your feet. Do the same thing with your legs, your chest, your head. Relax. The tension will start going away. Try smiling. It's almost impossible to be tense when you're smiling. There's certain things you just can't do. You can't, for instance, sneeze with your eyes open. You can't be tense when you're smiling. And secondly, and what I'm telling you right here is to simply get ready the way an athlete gets ready for an athletic event. Athletes don't go onto the playing field without warming up first. And we got to do the same thing before we take a test. Second thing is recapture the joy of some pleasant learning experience that you had. Remember the example of Jack Nicklaus before. What if Jack Nicklaus were to come by your home someday and you're an avid golfer and he showed you how to hold a club that would take a couple of strokes off your game? You would probably remember that learning experience for the rest of your life. Every one of us has got something like that, so bring that back just before we take a test. And then imagine and plan for success. There was an experiment one time with 3 groups to see if they could improve free throw shooting in basketball. The first group went out and practiced actually shooting baskets. The second group were put in a room and they were instructed, simply practice shooting baskets in your mind. And the third group was told to do nothing. When the experiment was over, guess what the results were? The first group that actually threw baskets improved by about 25%. The group that didn't do anything showed no improvement. The second group that simply practiced shooting baskets in their minds improved by 24%, practically the same as the ones that were actually shooting baskets. we can do wonders with our mind. And fourth, repeat positive affirmations. Positive affirmations. Henry Ford one time said something that was worth noting. If you think you can do it, you're right. If you think you can't do anything, you're still right. But now when we talk about being positive, don't be like one of the students who told his parents that he was going to flunk a test. And his dad said, hey, look, why don't you be more positive? And the student said, okay, I'm positive I'm going to flunk the test. Another exercise that we can do with our brain that's been tested and proven to be very effective is starting to do mental exercises, mental games, like playing chess. They tracked people that started playing chess in clubs around the United States, and they found out that before and after taking IQ tests, that after playing chess for a few months, their IQ scores went up 5 and 6 points, just simply by exercising and getting their brain going. Do puzzles. Try answering questions on programs like Jeopardy. But there's one thing about the brain that we can also consider, and that is it gets tired like the muscles. And sometimes we just can't take off. We've got this test coming up the next day, maybe we're working, and we've got to get home and study. Here's a simple 3-step process if that happens, and you need about an hour of wide awake time. First, prop up your feet. The blood and the oxygen will get back more easily to your brain if you get your feet propped up higher than your head. Now, if you're listening on cassettes in your car, don't do this yet. Then try deep breathing for about 3 or 4 minutes. What happens when we have when we breathe shallowly, we don't get the oxygen going. You see, so if you take some good deep breaths for a few minutes, the oxygen will begin to come back. And thirdly, eat a little bit of something sweet, because when we get fatigued, our blood sugar level drops off. And of course, I'm sure that you know this. Have you ever had a real heavy meal and tried to study afterwards? You know why you can't, or at least not very effectively? It's because the blood is going away from the brain into your stomach to help in digestion. So don't eat a heavy meal before studying or taking a test. And the chemicals in sleeping pills reduce recall by about 5 to 10%. So I recommend not taking sleeping pills either. We want to keep every single percentage of recall that we have. Another thing that the brain does is it thrives on periods of meditation. You've heard the expression, let it sink in. Well, there's truth to that, letting it sink in. Some people have asked me about subliminal tapes. You've heard of them, I'm sure. I've purchased a half a dozen different types and tried them, and frankly, I haven't had much success with them, but that doesn't mean that they don't work. I simply just can't seem to get them to work, but maybe some of you have tried it, and maybe they work. Again, try things on yourself that work. I'm not suggesting that you use every technique that we're talking about here today. I'm suggesting to pick out the ones that suit you and use those. We're not going to have to use 125 or 150 of these techniques and get 1 point each. Let's face it, if you're gliding along at about 75 or 80% in some of these techniques, if nothing else, just using this erasable pen on an exam so that your exams are neater, you don't have all these crossed out things and all these bad erasures and arrows, that might get you the result that you want alone. Here are a couple of books that I suggest. We don't have enough time to go through everything, but here are some of the good books. I brought 3 of them along. One of them that I've used for years, and this is great when you get down on yourself and you feel depressed. It's called The Power of Your Subconscious Mind by Dr. Joe Murphy. You can get these books in bookstores. In fact, they're in the library. They're so popular that they are in library. Here's one that's very popular on the bestseller list for a long time, Psycho-Cybernetics by Maxwell Maltz, a medical doctor. Another one, third one, Your Maximum Mind by Dr. Herbert Benson. And of course, there are many more.
At this time, we're going to take a brief break and review some of Professor Olney's important tips. For additional tips and explanations, read your seminar manual. Study in short bursts, 5 to 15 minutes each. Use waiting times, such as when you're in a store or stuck in traffic, to review study notes on index cards. Use props when giving a speech. Write reminder points on the back of your props. Don't highlight what you know, only mark points you don't know. Develop specific goals, not general ones. Write your goals down. Clearly define the steps you'll have to take to achieve your goals. Set goals that make you stretch. Learn to exercise your brain. Approach courses, projects, and tests with a positive, can-do attitude.
Number 4, choose what you like. Choose what you like. That's right. James started with Spanish in high school. He wasn't particularly interested in it. I guess maybe he thought, well, it's an easy language, so you take it. But he had a fascination with Russian. And so that's what he took, and he did extremely well with it, even though it was hard. My daughter took Spanish. Again, it's about the same thing. Now she's taking French. It's A's in French instead of B's and C's in Spanish. Robert, the one that was just up here, ended up taking German. He liked it so much that he majored in it. Sometimes we take a course and we finally decide after the first week or so that we're in the wrong situation. Have you ever had something like that happen? Maybe a conflict with a teacher. If it's possible, my recommendation is dropping it and taking it at a later time, or taking it from someone else, or taking a different course. Do you ever see that old newsreel? It's a stormy sky, and these sailors are hanging onto a rope, and a blimp looks like it's going to tear away from its mooring. And here they are, half a dozen of them are hanging on for dear life, and it does break. And it pulls these sailors up in the sky, and 2 or 3 of them jump off at about 5 or 10 feet, and of course they survive. Then there's a few more that are still hanging on, and they go way up in the sky into this ominous cloudy sky, and they fall to their death. You know, if they would have thought about it ahead of time, what should I do if something like this happens? They'd probably drop off. So maybe we should think about that. What are we going to do if we get into a bad situation? Successful investors are those who get out early out of bad situations. I want to show you a couple of these certificates that we get, because you can imagine how I felt when James came home with a report card with 6 A's after an average high school. And then he came home with a certificate. Arizona State University, James Olney has achieved a grade point of 4.0. Can you imagine? My chest was bursting with pride. Here's a guy, here's this athlete. Admissions office says he doesn't belong here. He gets 9 A's and comes home with this certificate. You know what I did? I rushed out and I went down to Kmart, bought the best frame I could get, and I framed it. Now, what happens if you cannot drop, or if you have to take a course? Do you know what you could do? You could try to make the best of it. And here's a clever little ploy. In fact, let's try it right now. Let's assume that we're in a bad situation, or we're in a boring class. How in the world can you sit through this thing and get the key points? Because there are only maybe a half a dozen key points in every class. And if you can pick those things out, you'll be all right when it comes time for a test. All right, let's try it right now. If you're in a class like that, have you ever watched a cat trying to concentrate on a mouse, or a lion on some animal. What do? Their ears go up, their eyes are glued, they lean forward into this thing. They are all concentration. Let's try it. Lean forward just for a minute or two here. Everyone lean forward. We're going to put something on the board. We'll see if this works. I'm going to put a number, 31, on the board. Everyone concentrate on that thing for just a moment. Okay, now I'm going to cover the number up. Okay, what's the number? 31. Everyone now knows that's 31. You see, before, we didn't know 31 was that number that I told you. Ah, that's kind of corny, isn't it? But it will work. Let's look at this diagram again. How do we solve that particular little puzzle? We do an X. We start out here. 1, 2, 3, 4. There it is. But you see, to do it, we had to go outside of those confines. Now, number 5, get to know your teachers. If you have a choice, pick a good teacher over a good course. Pick a good teacher over a good course. If you've got a poor language teacher, maybe teaching French or German or Spanish, and you've got a good language teacher that's teaching Russian or something even hard, Chinese, you'll do a lot better if you pick a good teacher. My son, taking Russian, picked an instructor who was the teacher of the year. He could hardly wait to get to class on Monday. He said that Russian class was so exciting. Consider this. If you're on the football team and you're on good terms with the football coach who's teaching at our high school, he taught math, and the assistant coach taught history. Our drama coach taught German. The band director taught chemistry. Speech director taught physics. Well, it stands to reason that if you're on good terms, friendly terms, and you're helping this person to put on a nice performance at halftime in the band or to score a touchdown during the game, he or she is going to go out of their way for you. At a college up in Ashland, Oregon, it's called Southern Oregon College, they conducted a survey that proved that fact. If you find teachers that you can get along with, who think about the same as you do, these students consistently got higher grades. Now, what about putting on a little tiny bit of pressure on a teacher? We can do that. Oh, the lifeguard that we talked about earlier with his 39 A's maybe didn't like doing it. But let me tell you a story about one of the students in my class some years ago when I taught real estate law. She asked, I was building a house at the time, finishing a house, and I invited all the class over to look at the house and see how it was going. She asked if she could bring her husband along, and I said, sure. She's an older lady, and when they showed up, she had a great big strawberry pie in her hands, just loaded down with whipped cream, and I said, oh, you didn't have to do that. And she said, well, you know, I enjoy the class, and you were kind enough to let my husband come along. And not only that, but I made 4 of them. So I took the pie, and I put it on the counter in the kitchen, and everyone went through the house. What do you think I did when everyone finally left? Everyone always says that, eat the pie. I couldn't eat that pie before I found out what kind of grade I was giving her. I waited until Monday morning, and I went down and I looked at the grades, and fortunately, she was just above the A cutoff. Now, I got a good question for you. Let's assume, and I'll draw a little cutoff on the board, let's assume that instead of being just above the A cutoff, here's the A, here's the B, and here's the C, and let's say that the A cutoff is maybe 220 points in a whole semester. What if, instead of being just above the A cutoff, she'd have been just below it by 1 point? And no one knew what the cutoff was. Would you consider changing her or changing the cutoff for A's so that she'd now be included? How about you? The gentleman in the front row is saying yes. How about you? You'd change it too. How about you? A third young lady would change it. You change it? Are you just doing it because they say so, or is it? How about you? Oh, she's thinking about it. Left brain type right here. Oh, I don't know. 220, that's final. How about you? He doesn't know either. Look at this. Do you mean to say that grades are given out because of cherry pies or strawberry pies? It's a strange world, isn't it? Postcards can have a subtle effect. Here's what I suggest to you. When you take your final exams, give your teacher a postcard and ask her, would you please send the final exam grade to me? Now, why would you do that? Because it's a little psychological edge. When she's looking through her grades, if you're right there, about just a point away, oh boy, I might see this student at the grocery store, I might see him on the street, and oh boy, I got to actually write the grade down and mail it to him. I feel a little... Not only that, but here's a second advantage to it. If the grade is borderline, you can then go in and talk to your teacher and say, hey, look, I had a couple of these questions. They're real close. Don't you think I'm only 1 point away? Don't you think before the grades are turned into the principal's office, it's a lot easier for your teacher to make that little adjustment than it is once she's turned it in. Then she's got to turn in a grade change. The principal calls her in and says, what are you changing all these grades for? And she says, well, mathematical error. And he says, yeah, sure, but they're always one direction. My son learned that in his freshman year. Took a physics course. Had a little bit of, had a 249, 250 was the cutoff. He didn't go in until after he received a B in the course. And all he had to do was to get one more point. And there was an extra credit of 2 points that he could have picked up by going out to the observatory out at ASU and observe Saturn. But the only problem was Saturn didn't appear until about 4 in the morning. So he set his alarm, got up, went outside, it was raining out. Couldn't see anything. So he went back and went to bed. The students that checked in got 2 points for at least checking in. He didn't get it. He went in to see the teacher and he says, hey, look, I got up, it was raining, I didn't come out. Don't I get some credit for being a little bright and not coming down? Teacher said, well, I've turned the grades in already, I'm sorry, you got 249. I conducted a little experiment. I went up and down our hallway at school, and I gave that a hypothetical case. I said, what would happen if you were a teacher and someone came in with a 249, they're only 1 off, they've got all A's on the report card except this 1 B, and they say that they did go out, it was cloudy, would you give them 1 point before you've turned in your grades? Do you know that something like 9 out of 10 of the instructors said that they would change it, pretty much like this? Then I went on the next floor and I asked the other teachers the same question, but I changed it one little bit. And I said, would you change it if you've turned in your grades already? Do you know it was something like 9 out of 10 that said they would not change their grades? So sometimes the difference between an A and a B is timing, going in and putting a little bit of pressure on. Extra credit. What about extra credit? Young fellow in high school volunteered to take care of lab mice for his teacher during Christmas vacation so the teacher could go off on a ski trip. And it was nothing difficult because he went past the school on his paper route anyway. So it was just a matter of going in and handling these little lab mice and feeding them and watching after them. At the end of the semester, he found himself in the same position, just on the borderline. And he asked the teacher, Could I get a little extra credit for doing that? Because teacher says, well, I think that you've learned something from it. I think it's worth a point, and gave him an A instead of a B. Keep a card file on good teachers and good instructors. Go around the school and find out. Say, what do you recommend for language? What science do you recommend? Mark those down. After a test, if you got a poor grade, you don't have to go and give up on it. I'd suggest going in and seeing the teacher and asking the teacher, would you please go over this with me and tell me where I went wrong so that I can do better on the next one? Do you know at the end of the semester, that might be the difference between an A and a B or a B and a C. Because now you've got the teacher involved. The teacher will feel like she's failing her job if you don't do well because she's helping you pass this test, you see. Now, number 6, the full speed ahead approach, at least for maybe a week or two. And this is for the more competitive of you. I'm not suggesting this for everyone, but here's what I'm suggesting. For about 1 week, overstudy. Just work this thing left and right. Just learn things so well. And you know why you do that? Because so often the first impression will carry you through the entire semester, or as in the case with athletes, through the entire season. If you go out and you can kick a field goal in practice when you first go out, you're going to be the field goal kicker. If you go out and get an A on the first test, your teacher is going to think, hey, this is a bright person here. If you don't do too well on one of the other tests, he or she will say, well, everyone makes a mistake. Everyone misses a field goal every once in a while. So psychologically, we remember the first thing better than everything that follows. We remember the first person on the moon. We remember the first person to break the 4-minute mile. We remember the first company that comes out with a tissue. What is it? Kleenex, everyone says. Why are we ignoring everybody else? We remember the first photocopying machine. In fact, so much so that we try to call all of photocopying Xeroxing. So, be first, but once you start, let me give you this little caution. Because my friend Austin, I talked about earlier, came down from Flagstaff to play tennis one day, and we had 3 people, and I needed a 4th. So James, who loves tennis and taught tennis, instructor in it, I asked him if he would come out and be our 4th. You know what he said? He says, I got to study my Russian just one more time. I got a couple of good grades going, and just let me study one more time. This is a guy who's not supposed to be this super student. So it'll happen to you too. You'll get so involved when you start getting A's and successes that you won't want to let up on yourself. So remember this afternoon. You've got to kind of ease back a little bit. What's the difference between an unsuccessful person and a successful person? An unsuccessful person, if he's given a project, will typically say this: well, I'll give it 3 weeks. If it doesn't work out, I'll admit defeat and I'll quit. And I'll let somebody else get successful. The successful person, on the other hand, says something like this when you give them a project. Well, I'm going to take it and I'm going to give it all I've got. That's the only difference between success and failure. I'm going to give it all I got. Do you know what? Our mothers fit into one of those 2 categories. You know which one? Can you imagine this? Going up to some new mother, a little baby, and asking her that same question, the successful, unsuccessful question. And here's the question to ask her. Try it. Say, young mother, how long are you going to spend teaching your child to walk? Well, she'll look at you with a startled, what do you mean, how long? I'm going to give it all I've got. If it takes 3 months, 6 months, I don't care, year. You know where the proof of that is? Look at us, we can all walk. Not one of our mothers gave up on us. They're successful people. I remember years ago when I was going to school, I had a job in the summer. It was very hard to get a job one summer in Milwaukee. I tried to get construction jobs, and you couldn't get that, and working here and there. So I finally answered one of these ads to sell door to door, and to sell furnaces door to door in Milwaukee in the summer. Can you imagine that? Well, I went out, and I couldn't sell. I'd go to the door, people would say no. Go to another door, they'd say no. I worked with a friend of mine who had lost his arm in a boating accident. He was always late. I remember one day, I went up to this corner house to knock on the door, hoping that the person wouldn't say no again. And I heard the familiar sound of his car coming around the corner, again, late. Now picture this, one arm. He's coming around the corner, he's shifting, he's steering, he's beeping the horn, and he's waving. I thought of that later, and I thought to myself, how does he do it? And why am I complaining? It gave me a renewed faith in myself. I walked up to that door and I pushed the button, and the lady opened the door, and guess what? I didn't sell a thing. I wish I could tell you that it worked, but it didn't. But it did do something. It made me a believer of a trait in personalities that is very important, and that is persistence. And there's a saying about persistence. Nothing takes the place of persistence. And I did persist, and I finally started selling furnaces that summer, to the complete surprise of my parents, who couldn't believe it. A talent won't take the place of persistence. Many unsuccessful people around with talent. Genius will not take the place of persistence. There's a lot of unrewarded genius. Education alone will not. The world's full of educated derelicts. But persistence, in a speech by Calvin Coolidge, is one of the best traits toward success. Say, who was Calvin Coolidge? Which president was he? Anyone know? Was he 20th? Was he 25th? Was he 30th? 30th President of the United States. Now, how do I remember all the presidents, and how can I remember them in order? Particularly me, a right-brained person who doesn't like sitting in the library memorizing things. Well, that's our next topic. The next technique we're going to talk about is number 7, our memory. Now, how can I memorize the presidents in order quickly and easily? Well, my method, which I devised years ago, goes something like this. I made up a word for each number. For instance, for me, the number 1 is the word one. You win something. Number 2 is pear. Number 3 is tree. 4, star. 5 foot, 6-pack, 7-up. 8, for instance, you ate an apple. 9 iron, and 10. Now, there are memory books. Harry Lorraine and Jerry Lucas wrote one, and there are any number of others that get into much more detail. But that little system of mine served me very well. And you see now how I can remember the presidents in order. Number 10 is tent, and I tie down a tent, so the 10th president for me is Tyler. The 9th president, 9 iron, I associate with a hairy shot, so it's Harrison. 8, the 8th president. I ate somewhere. I ate in my van for Van Buren. And I can go through all the presidents like this. And it's very easy, and I won't forget them because I'm linking. And that's the much better way of recalling, because as I said before, we all have perfect memories. Years ago when I practiced law here, I had a accident case, a hit and run, And I had one of the witnesses to the accident hypnotized, and that witness could recall the license number of the car. Everything we see and hear goes into our brain. It's now a matter of pulling it out. And if you start using techniques, and there are easier techniques. For instance, in the manual, there's this church bulletin. And on the back of the bulletin, there are over a dozen advertisers. I put a few of them up here. And I'll show you how easy it is to memorize the advertisers in their order. For instance, the first advertiser is Scottsdale floor covering. Well, I simply used my simple method. Number one, I won a game on the Scottsdale floor. A pair for number two, I think of a pair of hands for Allstate, which is the second advertising. Three is a tree. In that advertisement, there's a little tree in front of a mortuary. So that's 3 for me. 4-star for a car wash. Have you ever been to a car wash and the car is wet and you look in the light and it looks like a star? And it goes on, 5 and 6. And you can do that with anything. And it makes things so much easier. And the nice thing about it is, for a test, you'll remember it. This is what's so nice, because you don't have to rely on rote memory. We've got 3 kinds of memories. We've got rote. That's the kind that we use when we're little. We memorize the ABCs and the numbers, 1, 2, 3. Babies are very good at rote memory. Of course, that's all they have to do all day long. They play with these little blocks. But you know, babies also memorize very naturally. They don't sit and play with blocks for an hour. Their concentration level drops. So what does a little baby do with blocks? They play with a block for just a few moments, then they set it aside, and they let it sink in. Then they come back to it later, and they do this back and forth, and lo and behold, in a few years, they can speak a language without ever having a class in it, because they come back to it. They don't spend a lot of time in the library. Oh, there's a nice way of handling, and I suggest that you make up your own system of memory. The system that Tony Bassan suggests in his book was this. Make a picture, and watch how easy this is going to be for all of us here today to set up our own system very quickly. Draw a picture for each number. Like, for instance, for number 1, a pen looks like a 1. So for him, number 1 is a pen. 2, can you see the swan in a 2? You make yourself a nice big 2 and it looks like a swan. How about 3? Remember birds when we drew them in grade school? You draw a little bird and that would be 3. 4, can you picture a sailboat? 5 is a hook. 6, maybe a snail. These are my own variations. You see, I like to make up my own. 7, maybe a cliff. 8 could be an hourglass. 9 could be a whistle. 10, a bat and a ball. Now when you start linking those two to something that you want to, particularly difficult, disjointed facts, you see there's no relation between one president and another. The 11th president, for instance, is in no way related. Well, we have a few related presidents, don't we? The 6th president, Adams, is the same as the 2nd president, Adams. But, and I used for the 2nd, to remember Adam, I use a pear. Instead of an apple for Adam and Eve, I have a pear for Adam and Eve. You see, and I won't forget that. Why don't we just cover this up for a moment, and we'll see how we can do on just those few little things. For instance, without looking at any manuals or without looking at anything up here, can anyone tell me what your new number will be for the number 4? What's the new? A sailboat, right. How about number 10? Bat and a ball. You see how easy that is? You can walk out of here with your own system today. If you use all your senses when you're memorizing, it's going to be a lot easier. If you read aloud, for instance, if you use a tape recorder, if you listen to yourself, if you watch videos.
Now let's review some of the important tips Professor Olney has just covered. When you have a choice, choose courses that interest you. Get to know your teachers. Don't be afraid to drop a bad course or a bad teacher. Picking good teachers is more important than picking courses. Make an all-out effort in the first 2 weeks of each term. Learn and use memory techniques. Now, a few tips on getting extra credit. View optional extra credit projects as mandatory. Take every opportunity to turn in extra credit. If a teacher doesn't offer extra credit projects, ask them what you can do to earn extra credit. When you turn in an extra credit project, ask for another. Ask your teachers what you can do to raise your grade.